Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We are in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I am your host, Pavini Moray, and I am here today and delighted to introduce you to Lee Harrington. And Lee is an internationally known sexuality, relationships, and personal authenticity educator. He's an award-winning author and editor on gender, sexual, and sacred experience, and his books include Traversing Gender, Understanding Transgender Journeys, and Sacred Kink, The Eightfold Paths of BDSM and Beyond, among many other titles. And he's been blogging online since 1998, and he's been teaching worldwide since 2001. And you can check out Lee's adventures, as well as his regular podcast, his tour schedule, free essays, videos, and more over at his website, which is passionandsoul.com. That's passionandsoul.com. Hi, Lee. Welcome. So glad to have you today.
I am so honored to get to join you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I just would love if you would jump in and just tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. I've been really honored that since the late 90s, I've had a chance to do sexuality connection with people as an educator, whether it's doing one-on-one sessions or whether it is doing large group classes and university work. And along the way, I actually just yesterday, it's perfect timing, had a tattoo done as a reminder that my job in the world as a writer is to have it be to speak the will of the gods and the ancestors, to have this be the capital W work that I do in the world. And when you were referring to some of the different things I've been doing, it was really touching to me to have this moment of reflection that whether I am on a stage or speaking for transgender rights up here in Alaska, or whether it's having an opportunity to help somebody decompress with a ritual and find their own solace, that it's an opportunity to do those moments of connection with spirit and with those who are here before us.
It's beautiful. It seems very timely.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, kind of the threads that I'm weaving are about sex and trauma and ancestors and healing. And I know that those are things that you're holding as well. And just curious about this piece around sex magic, ancestral reverence, in particular, around the queer wound of HIV/AIDS. How you hold that, what you see are the particular practices of healing.
Yeah. So when I first got involved in my first relationship, I was 13 and he was 16. And by the time he was 16, he'd buried two of his lovers from AIDS because he was involved with NAMBLA, which for those who don't know is the North American Man-Boy Love Association. And I'm not saying I condone their practices or find them appropriate in any way, but it is part of my history. And so having that been so ingrained in my youth that death is part of the sexual journey, that these things became interwoven in a thing that one must not just acknowledge, but cherish and appreciate. And that each chance we're having an opportunity to connect sexually in that era, when we're talking about at this point for me, the early 90s, when I was having those experiences, it was a requirement in my heart to also take a moment and say thank you to those who had been forebears, not just of mine, of a bloodline, but of those who had been of men who love men. And as a transgender man, that was its own layer of conversation. And it was interesting because I've been thinking about this recently, and I have a lot of people who talk about people we lost in the AIDS crisis and who lost in the plague in a past tense. But my former daddy just died 2 years ago of AIDS. His meds gave him a long stretch, but he was one of the men who were diagnosed in the 80s, and he finally passed, and it was part of his journey. And so to me, one of the things that was important when when he did go was to take a moment in my own body erotic self-exploration and to spend some time going back to those times he and I were together. And to have those moments of remembering not just who he was, but who I was with him and the gifts and the magic we made together. I find that these things can be interwoven with each other. And I find sometimes when people talk about doing sexual magic working, it's about either, using sex as a battery for doing a spell or to do some sort of working, or for doing a timeline to go back and connect with that individual person. But for me, one of the biggest things has been going back and connecting with who I was with him, because that was one of the largest gifts he ever gave me, was finding me.
I really appreciate that, because I think that is something we don't really think about, how every person who we share our body with becomes part of the story of our body, right? And the story of who we were. And do you know who Jack Davis is?
I'm not sure, actually.
He's a drag performer, old school drag performer and artist, performance artist, ritualist in San Francisco. And it's one of the things that he's talked about is exactly what you're saying, the connections, the sexual connections with the men who were his teachers, who died of AIDS, are alive in his body. And that's one way to pay homage, is to recollect those encounters. So it sounds like that's part of a practice that you're having as well.
Absolutely. And part of that is also interwoven with those who I never got to know. I used to make a group of us used to have a joke back in the 90s of 6 degrees of blank, right? But it was 6 degrees of fuckery instead of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatnot, or 6 degrees of separation for the movie. And there's a part of my body that when I do take those moments to trace back erotic lineage, get to remember that if we look at those who have passed on in various queer communities especially, the lineage attaches pretty efficiently. I'd say quickly and easily, but that doesn't feel quite right. But it does attach to itself, that I can find those who are in my lover's lineages today in my body when I am playing with other gay men, that it attaches back in a circle of erotic connection through our ancestry fairly quickly at times.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Because of the transcendent quality of sexual connection, that extends beyond just the living into the realms of the unseen, into the dead. How are you holding the dead of AIDS? Like, what are the kinds of things that you're tending to ancestrally, magically? How are you holding that personally?
Well, I keep an ancestral altar actually in my temple, and my temple in my home is also my play space, my erotic play space. It has both working altars that I leave offerings at, as well as having bundles of, giant baskets full of rope and canes and safer sex supplies, because they are both things that are part of my magical experience. And to me, by having one of the things that I have on my ancestral altar underneath a skull that was crafted for me and covered in rhinestones and feathers and whatnot, underneath the skull is a hanky, a handkerchief that one would keep in their back pocket to flag or show what you're sexually into. It's a black leather one that was a gift from a woman named Joanne Gaddy, who was one of the reverends in Chicago who held people's hands. When they were passing. She said she stopped counting at 350. But she still has her little Ziploc baggies full of everyone's business cards from her Rolodex, and still carries those. But when I was early on in my own erotic journey, I think I was about 5 years into being part of the active BDSM communities, I was at her house and she said, "Hold on a minute." And she dug through her closet and found this leather handkerchief and handed it to me and said, "You need to remember the men who carried these," and handed it over to me and said it was from one of the first leather men who passed away with her holding his hand. And to me, by having his leather, right? A piece of his second skin, bearing witness to everything that I do in my erotic space, in my temple space, my space that is for prayer of all kinds. To me, I feel like I am not just giving homage to him or giving thanks to him, but having him be an active and appreciative voyeur of sorts, of somebody who creates more power by being present and us giving him power in turn.
I've been doing a lot of research for my dissertation around ancestors and sexuality. And one of the questions that I asked the people who I was interviewing was about sex and ancestors. And is it appropriate to make offerings of our sexual energy? Is it appropriate to even have kind of sex with ancestors in the dream world or in the etheric realms? Is there taboo around that?
Right.
And people had, answers all over the map. Some people having really, really particular practices of, I dedicate my orgasm to this particular ancestor, or, and then some people being like, I don't even have my ancestor altar in my bedroom. It crosses the incest lines. It's not okay,
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, because you just so eloquently said that about this person and their piece of leather. It sounds like there is an integration into your sexuality, into your personal practice of sex, of at least ancestral witnessing. And just curious if there's anything else you want to say about that.
Yeah, it's so one of the things that has happened, I'm invested a lot in the BDSM, kink, and leather communities more than a lot of what gets referred to as the, quote, vanilla queer communities, which is not meant as a judgment, simply as a matter of flavor of the day. And I actually joke, but I believe it's honestly true that that vanilla is an incredibly exotic flavor, and people have literally gone to war over it in the past. That it is a magical flavor as well. But having been part of these communities, one of the things that has come up a lot over the years is auctions or giving away of people's erotic toys after someone passes, because someone's biological family may or may not want someone's handcuffs, for example. And I have a set of handcuffs from Tony DeBlois, who was the gentleman who invented the leather pride flag, who was also the daddy of my former daddy. And so when I play with that toy, which I still do as part of my erotic personal practice with the living, I feel like I have in that moment both the physical skill that was passed to me by my daddy being an erotic term and a relationship term that he and I used together. But I also have the moment that Tony probably put them on him. And I also have the moment of all of those other men who got to use that tool. So I have these fetishes or artifacts of erotic exploration that are part of my ancestral gifting that I've had over the years. So that's part of it. I also have some people that you'd mentioned dream work, and I went, that is a piece of my work. That there are specific spirits that I experience as having been part of queer mysteries throughout time that have worked with both men who have been before and men here today. And actually, I would say queer people beyond genders, not just men, but originally a number that I've talked to are ones that have worked with our spirits that have watched over gay men. And I do still offer them part of a spiritual tithing, as it were, an erotic tithing, because it is a currency that they understand and that they have cherished over the years. And so offering that tithing or whatnot makes sense to my skin.
And by tithing, you mean that you are making offerings of your erotic energy directly to them?
Yes. That notion that instead of it being something that, when I'm erotically called, I will do this, but instead it's more of I will offer this as a regular and ongoing practice in the same way that someone of the Catholic Church might offer 10% of their income as part of an offering to the church. Mine isn't necessarily 10%, but I'd say probably a good 1% of my erotic journey goes.
I'm so delighted right now.
I had this moment of self-judgment where I'm like, should I be offering more? No, that doesn't make it was a really interesting self-judgmental moment based on my own father's family's experience of Catholicism. I'm like, wait, hold on a second. You don't need to go there. Judgment is not helpful.
Wow, I love that. The idea of a committed, so it's not just like, oh, whenever I feel like it, but it's like, okay, you guys can show up for like dinner served at 6 p.m. on Sunday. Feel free to drop in
Yeah,
and pick up this offering. Yeah.
I'd say I make a commitment to about once a month offer something to them. And oftentimes it is sexual of nature. I've had a couple of times where it is showing up to an event and physically spending an hour or 7 building an altar space and running rituals for them. But I'd say most of the time it's sexual currency.
Talk to me a little bit about the reciprocity. Like, why are you doing this, and what do you get out of it, and kind of what's the exchange?
So when I was a teen, I spent a period of time not having enough access to food and shelter. And it wasn't a part of my entirety of my teen years, but I did have that period. And the folks that kept me alive, literally, were people who were, queer sex workers and geeky erotic nerds, and this beautiful blending of beings, not all who made it through that time period of their life. And having had that be part of my journey, and then not long after that, or around the same time period, it weaves in and out, of meeting that first partner of mine and his journey through how queer mysteries weave in and out with death. To me, it's looking back on my life and giving thanks in the same way that I would thank my mother every time I unfold the quilt that she made me as a baby. That's also, interestingly enough, in my temple space here in this room right now. I thank my biological mother when I have those moments of appreciation for the things that she's done, and I keep her on my altar. I actually keep her measuring tape rolled up there because being a crafter was so important to me. And even though you talk about the notion of where is incest and where is all of those moments of crossover, I'm a multi-generational kinky person. My mother was a corset fetishist and liked spanking. My father has in his life been a swinger. My mother's mother was a swinger. My father's father's mother was a fetish model back in the 1920s and 30s. And so for me, the notion of acknowledging and appreciating sexual journey might not be about being sexually connected with those who I'm biologically related to, but that blood walks in my veins in ways that sometimes when I talk to people on their erotic journeys, they don't know what their parents' sex life was like. They don't know what their parents' eroticism was like. And so therefore they don't necessarily have an empathy with it or a connection. And for me, mine is profoundly personal. Like, I found my father's Penthouse Forum magazines when I was 7, and I remember distinctly going, wow, this is, and I'd seen pornography before that, not because of any parents leaving it out or anything like that, but just because I was an inquisitive child that read anything I can find in any magazine rack or whatnot. And I'd seen these images, and it was the first time that I saw a short story. There was a letter to the editor, and the editor, this author said, I want to thank all of my friends in the kinky sex community for helping me make my dreams come true. And I remember as a child going, wow, I want to live in a world where beings make my dreams come true, whether it's sexual or otherwise. Like, I remember that, like, to this day, I still, my fingertips are remembering that slightly tacky plastinated bad magazine material of 1986, right? Or 19, like somewhere in that, like, I remember that under my fingertips. And because I was then able to, being a latchkey kid and whatnot, I found my parents' sex toy collections. And so for me, my acknowledgement and appreciation and understanding of my parents' sex life and how it ties in with my own and the pieces that I have empathy with them, whether it's my father who's still living or my mother who has since passed away, to me the two dance pretty easily. It was actually very sweet. Right before my mother passed away, we were down in Seattle. I live in Anchorage, Alaska right now, and my partner and I went down to Seattle. And even though my mother and I had talked about eroticism a number of times in my life, my mother was laying in her bed and pulled my partner over and said, down there in that box is where I keep my dildos. My son knows that I have dildos, but he doesn't need to see them. And it was this very sweet moment of simultaneous, like for her to me, like I felt this very sweet moment of a combination of her acknowledging her passing, her embracing my partner and their part in my life, and also having a love for me past this moment of when she was going to die, because she knew that I was going to be on my own process and in my own process. And so therefore handing something off to a loved one of mine created this intergenerational connection through sex toys. Like I found it deeply loving.
I just feel the welling in my heart listening to that, because I also hear still really good boundaries around as well, intergenerational boundaries around, like, so that there's this blessing bundle of eros that you've received through your lineages, right?
Yeah.
That comes with these boundaries that keep things clean, right? Just what a beautiful gift, and what an inspiration also, I think, to really consider what is the blessing bundle that we receive through our family of origin, right? We're probably usually quite aware of the burdens around sex, the inheritance around sex that we receive, whether it's repression or shame. But like, what are the gifts? Who were those ancestors who were joyfully asexual and who were proudly kinky, and who were deeply involved in these mysteries? It's like, somehow I think the dead sometimes get this, I don't know if sugar coating is the right word, but it's like this, instead of like, oh yeah, they were nasty kinksters too, and so how can we start to honor that all throughout our own blood lineages for the sake of our own erotic wellness, right?
Very much so. And for me, it's been acknowledging that those who have come before, that my ancestors, whether they be of blood or of calling, or of sexuality or of my spiritual work, that they are complex beings too. I am always so amazed, whether we're looking at spirits or gods or these individuals, like it's a complex story. And so when I look at my great grandmother, Kay Smith, she was simultaneously who's who, world artist, weaver, and sculptor, but also the woman who abandoned her children at an orphanage because she didn't want her husband to have them, right? She took her children and left them 50 miles from her husband, while she then went off to France to be able to go and be a surrealist and Dadaist performance artist. Like these things existed in her at the same time. And the fact that she was going off and going to crazy sex parties was side by side with the woman who struggled with depression. Those are both parts of what I carry as an inheritance from her as well. And I think you're right. Sometimes we hold our ancestors up on altars of a specific lens. This is my ancestor who was the rapist. This is my ancestor who was the survivor. This is my ancestor who was the scholar. Instead of looking at them as multifaceted jewels, some of which in a given moment we may or may not have more empathy for.
I think it's also important to just acknowledge that the dead do change or can change, right?
Yes, please speak more, because
I mean, I just wanting to hold that like, just because someone was a certain way during their life, in death, there's to a certain extent a greater opportunity, at least in my training, for quick change and resolution of stuff that maybe wasn't so great while they were alive. That the dead can become well, they can become bright in spirit, they can become the guardians of our temples, right? Like I think you're saying is that the ancestors that you're working with are beings that you inherently trust, to keep you safe while you're in these vulnerable, altered states that sex can produce. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Curious, because I just wanted to shift to a little bit here about your own journey with mental health. You identify, I know, as someone neurologically non-normative. And I know that you have done a lot of ancestral work with the honored dead in your family who have walked with madness and that you've really come to terms, and then gratitude for the gifts that they have given you in your own adventures with mental health. And I would love to hear more about this.
Yeah, it's so on my patrilineal side of the family, I have at least 5 generations going back of different forms of mood adventure. And so for a long time, I just, whether it was my father or grandma, like I would just berate their name. And how, why would you even birth me if you knew that this is what comes down through the family tree? There was a lot of anger and resentment because it's not always a happy place to be. And it is something that has affected my journey as a sexual being. Like I have had periods where I have not been kind to those who have either been my lovers or people who have been in service to me, and not because of any sort of conscious act, but because of how that has flowed through me and how that has come up through me and manifested. And which I take a lot of responsibility for, because even if it's something that's been passed down through generations, doesn't mean it's not mine to deal with. And about 7 years ago, 7 years ago, I was flipping through a photo album that I have that's all reproductions of some of the original photographs from the 1800s and early 1900s of biological family of mine, mostly through that patrilineal side. And I was looking at them, and there was a part of my brain that was like, oh, well, that person had bipolar, that person, like, there was this part of this bitter part of my tongue that just kept listing their illnesses. And then I got to a photo of my father's mother and went, oh, because she was sitting next to one of her paintings. And I have this painting. It's a dove sitting outside the Sopra de Minerva. No, not the, outside of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And I saw her next to that painting, and this body moment just hit, and I felt my shoulders go back, and like there's a weight on the top of my chest just above my collarbones. And I remembered looking at it and going, oh, she couldn't have painted without her mania. And then a moment later, it hit me again like this second wave. She paints. And then it hit me again like this other wave, and it felt like this is a gift. I paint. And suddenly, as a painter, I felt this in my body, this sensation that I needed for this moment, that in a scientifically aggregated world, being able to list labels that have been given by mental health professionals, they are useful technology for being able to address an issue or have conversations about something that's going on. But this sensation came over me that label is another way to look at a blessing as well. That it was the hours that she would spend up for 3 or 4 days in a row. Those were the days where she had the ability to clean her entire house in 2 sittings while in between rounds of laying down oil paint. Those were the same days as when her, youngest daughter would ask her something and she would just start oversharing everything that child probably shouldn't have necessarily needed to know at 6. That was the same woman in that same day. And my skin body that knows how blessed I feel for getting to be a painter stopped in that moment. And I asked permission of my partner at the time, the boy that was in service to me at the time, and said, I had this idea for a ritual. Are you available to bear witness tonight? And he said, yeah, I am. And I laid out an altar that was set with various objects that I knew they loved, that were either theirs themselves or foods that they enjoyed or pieces of poetry, and lit candles for the different quadrants, different quarters. And I pulled out of the photo album, as I just went through the entire album, I pulled out their name, their photos, and I said their name. And I said their blessings that I'd been given. Because the day, earlier that day, I'd been listing all of their illnesses, their scientifically labeled and categorized illnesses. And instead, there, under the eye of a sacred witness, I had the opportunity to go through these amazing faces and look them in the eye, because these were all photographs that looked at the camera, some of them from 150 years ago, as they stared back, having to keep those eyes open, waiting for the shutter to take a long enough of a shot. And I stared back at these eyes in Ireland and Montana and Norway and looked at them and said, thank you. And then left those photographs out for a full month. And then at the end, when I put them back into that album, I remember to do so at a time where I was feeling well in my body and my heart and my mind. And I put them away with a smile instead of with the bitterness that I'd been carrying that album around with before. So that was one of the ways that I worked through a lot of my challenges. And they're challenges that I still dance with, but it's been a gift to me having done that work. In side by side with a lot of my own, I was doing a year of outpatient treatment at the same time and made a choice to, I didn't think of it until just this now, but I did both my work with myself and my work with them interlaced with each other. And it feels, looking back on it, a little like they were looking out for me as I was doing my own work as well.
So you were healing, and you were, by seeing them and removing the labels on them, allowing them to heal, and they were reciprocating by supporting you in your healing.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. And it's just interesting, like just all over the world, this is what the research about ancestral reverence demonstrates, is this this reciprocal healing that we do with our ancestors, that we help them, that they help us, that's actually, that there's something being, like, there's something moving through the line.
Yeah.
And we're just the living face of it. And so we do our part, it's not separate. It's like one living organism, many different iterations of the same living organism. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about ritual and how it interfaces with trauma healing.
So as I mentioned before, I'm really involved with BDSM, kink, and leather communities. And for me, that's about conscious exploration, not just of body capacity and heart capacity, but spiritual capacity. And this idea of diving into what gets called taboo and what overculture says is not quite normal, which normal is its own loaded word in culture. And so for me, within those communities, I feel like I've received a really large gift around how to process trauma. And I'm just going to speak from my own sexual experience, because I'm sure there's other tools available for people who do not follow these practices. These practices are not, be all, end all. They're just the practices I use. I have both myself been somebody who has experienced or survived, depending on how we're looking at it, sexually traumatic experiences, as well as somebody who has been partners of or lovers of people who have been. And one of the most amazing things I have found in these various kink practices is that there are erotic activities that can resemble the things that we are survivors or experiencers of. People who do what gets referred to as consensual non-consent play, which is the idea that it might look like non-consensual activity from the outside, but everybody involved has consented to it. And at any moment, any of these parties can say, no, that's where I need to stop, but thank you. This is where I need to stop today, but thank you. And that we have that capacity at any moment. I sometimes have the challenge with the word play that gets used in those discussions, because to me, it's not play. I mean, that's capital W work in the world, potentially, whether we're conscious of it or not. The difference being between things that look like I'm struggling or look like I'm even reenacting those moments of trauma, the difference is that at any moment, anyone involved can say, no more, but thank you. and that the other person will listen, honor, and respect with the fullness of heart. When I have done work with people in those directions, whether it is around things that look like physical assault, sexual assault, verbal assault, shaming, humiliation, they are things that might look like those things to the outsider, but they are activities that are done with all parties involved coming from a full consciousness as much as they can bring in that moment, and with the capacity to back out. And it's not just about doing the activities or things that look like the activities in question. And for myself, I got to bear witness to, and I was talking with someone very dear to me who, it was a gentleman who was African American who was looking at his own past, like looking at his past lineage, and he decided he wanted to do a scenario and that was going to be around a lynching. And even saying those words, like, as somebody who is white, like, I'm feeling this thing in my body of, is this the right thing for me to tell this story? And I will acknowledge out loud that I am a white person. This is not my story, but the person who this story is about is somebody whose whiteness deeply informs what he got out of it as the giver. And this person, all of his friends looked at him and said, we're not going to be that person because we care about you. We love you and appreciate you. We're not going to be those people. And it took him a while to have them agree that this is what he really wanted. And as close friends, they would help him create this. And they negotiated it for months. And they showed up, and there was the tree, and there was the rope, and there was a group of people in white. However, in the midst of the scene, while everybody was in, one of the people in white wandered away. And another friend of mine caught him and said, hey, where are you going? Are you okay? And the person stopped and realized that the words that had been coming out of his mouth were the words that his great-grandfather and grandfather used to say, were the words of hate that as a white man who was from the South, those were the words that had been etched on his tongue. And these are the words he had just said to one of his best friends. And in that moment, as the person who had even said those words of hate, he had an opportunity to work through the trauma that had been handed to him. Because the trauma of racism is not just affecting one person or people of one background. The trauma of racism affects all of us. And in that moment of using a technology available from a sexual community, he had a chance to face that trauma head on in ways that I don't know if he would have ever gotten to in this lifetime. As a child of people who had actually done a grandchild of people who had actually done those behaviors. And so that's an intense story. It was what was moved to come off my tongue, so thank you for bearing witness. But there's also just times where, for myself, working through trauma is about those moments that those little whispers that are not my own voice, that are the voices of people who have done harm, that are their story that I'm carrying inside me and with me. Because as you mentioned before, sometimes our lovers are what we carry around with us, and some of us didn't get to choose all of our lovers. When their voices come up inside me getting to say and choose to go and embrace my masturbation and my full pleasure here in this skin suit, it's an amazing tool for working through those traumas, because in this moment, it is me choosing my profoundly embodied, powerful being that has been passed down through generations, both of my sexual journey and my spiritual journey and the generations of my blood journey. And here I am right now embracing my bliss. That is an amazing tool for looking at those moments of trauma, because I am more than my trauma. I am me manifested. And in this moment, I'm me manifested that happens to have a Hitachi. How beautiful is that?
I think you're really beautiful. Just feel such a deep gratitude for getting to sit with you. And thank you for taking the risk on that story. Like, you know, I'm on mute, but like, and you can't see what I'm doing, but I was over here going, yes, please bringing it home, you know, just really feeling the truth of that, of how do we transform these historical transgenerational harms that either we have endured or our ancestors have perpetrated, right? Or both.
Yeah.
And how do we do that in a conscious, embodied way that also lifts up other people who our ancestors may, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful example. And a risky one to name publicly. So thank you for that generosity, and thank you to the folks who were involved in that and whose story was shared. I really appreciate their work on that too.
And my hope is also, if anybody who saw that scene and knows about it, my hope is that you'll know now some of the context behind it, because the event that it took place at a public event. And even though it wasn't visible to everyone, there were people who wandered by who didn't know the context and saw a group of white men perpetrating harm against someone. And I think that's some of the things that we need to look at too when we're working through our own trauma and our own challenges, and the things when we are doing, whether it's performance art or laying out an altar or doing that kind of work, knowing that it will have what I refer to as a splash zone, that our work affects the others who bear witness to it, and we don't know their stories and where they're at in a moment. So I think that is one of the things to consider as well when we are doing trauma working, is who else is the work that we're doing affecting, and is it just creating a ripple forward? Because I think there were people, actually I shouldn't say I think, I know of at least one person who was also African American, who is now sat with for the last, I think that was about 6 years ago, no more than that, but who has been working through the experience of visually bearing witness to that. And when you were mentioning before about not, that for some people doing ancestral work in the bedroom is a line, that means it's worth considering when we're having a lover, even if it's pickup play, right? Somebody that we met on Craigslist or Grindr or whatever, whether or not that's a line for them, to acknowledge the humanity in all of our lovers is worth considering, at least.
And that they are all showing up with all of their ancestors.
Thank you.
Right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry. That just hit me like right at my solar plexus. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
It's kind of crowded in the bedroom. Yeah. With everybody's lovers and everybody's ancestors. Yeah.
Yes.
Lee, thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's been just a delight and an honor. I just want to also, I want to direct folks to your website, but I also just wanted to give you a chance to, I know you have a book coming out that I'm actually in, and I just wanted to see if you wanted to speak to that at all.
Yeah. April 2nd, I and Phoenix Cassian have a book coming out called Queer Magic, Power Beyond Boundaries, where we have 43 amazing contributors talking across a breadth of topics and personal identities and experiences on everything from a Lakumi elder talking about his experiences in the Bay Area as an African-American man also growing up in Baltimore, through to people talking about intersectionality and inclusivity in Wicca, to an academic lecture, essay, it feels like a lecture, but in the best of ways, on looking at ergi experiences or queer gendered experiences in Norse tradition, and comic book strips. And everything in between. And I feel so honored to have had a chance to get to edit this anthology, including your beautiful piece about working with trans ancestors, the Transcestors.
I'm excited for that to come out. And I want to direct folks to your website, which is passionandsoul.com. Where you have books and your writings and your teaching schedule and your tour schedule and all of your events, everything that's coming up. Any way that folks can connect with you is at passionandsoul.com. And just want to say thank you so much for your time today. Thanks, folks, for listening to this episode. I would love to hear from you about how this podcast is impacting your life. I've been hearing from a lot of folks what you're learning, who else you'd like to have interviewed. You can use the contact form on bespokenbones.com to be in touch with me, to ask questions that you'd like to have answered on the show, and to learn more about the ancestral lineage healing work that I'm offering. Also, if you are in the San Francisco Bay Area, Taya Shear and I are now offering a monthly ancestor circle. And so you can check that out at trancestralhealing.com for more info, and maybe we'll see you there. And I am Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.